What's happening, everybody? It's Sean with reactions to the classics, and today we got a reaction to the Sex Pistols. Never mind the Bollocks. Here comes the Sex Pistols, their only album, brought to us by a vote in the patron community. One of our exclusive album reactions we do on Patreon. If you're watching this on YouTube, this was put up months ago on Patreon. We take a vote every month, and I do a reaction exclusively, at least for a good time period, at Patreon. So if you want to support us in any way, check out that Patreon link below, the Patreon link on the end screen. I appreciate all the patrons out there. We could not do this without you. All right, let's jump into this album. I've never listened to this album. There's very few albums now, as we're 5.5 years into this channel and 3,000 plus videos. There's very few classic albums, like real classics, that I have not listened to. But there are some, and this is one of them. And so I really dove into the research on this. I'm not going to kill you on it, but it's going to be more detailed because obviously it's so influential for various reasons, and I know anything about it. I started out with 53 pages to go through on the research, so I feel like I have a good handle on this album, yet I've never heard it. So let's jump into it. It's, of course, the only studio album by the Sex Pistols, released in October of 1977 through Virgin Records in the UK, and the next month, November 77, through Warner Brothers in the US. As a result of their volatile internal relationships, the band's lineup saw changes during the recording of the album. Original bass guitarist Glenn Matlock left the band early in the recording process, and while he's credited as a co-writer on all but 2 of the tracks, he only played bass and sang backing vocals on one track, Anarchy in the UK, which was a year before, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Recording sessions continued with new bass player Sid Vicious, who was credited on 2 of the songs written by the band after he joined. But Vicious's bass playing appears on only 2 tracks. Why? Because he couldn't really play bass. So the other bass parts were played by the great guitarist Steve Jones. Drummer Paul Cook, Jones, and singer Johnny Rotten appear on every track. The various recording sessions were led alternately by Chris Thomas or Bill Price, sometimes both of them together. I'm not even going to get into all of that. But as the songs on the final album often combine mixes from all the different sessions, they credited them both as joint producers. Now, by the time of this release, now I'm from the United States, and I mean, at the time, all this stuff started going down in 1976. I'd have been 5 years old. So if you're in the UK and you're older, you're going to know, like, you lived this out. It's different for me going back and looking at it. But by the time this album came out, they were already way controversial because they'd already released 4 singles. But they had spoke profanity on live TV, been fired from not 1 but 2 record labels. I'll get into that. And been banned from playing live in some parts of Britain. The album title added to that controversy, with some people finding the word Bollocks offensive. Many record stores refused to carry it, and some record charts refused to list its title, showing just a blank space instead. Due in part to its notoriety, and in spite of the many sales bans at major retailers, the album debuted at #1 on the UK album charts. It achieved advance orders of 125,000 copies after a week of its release, and went gold only a few weeks later. It remained a bestseller for nearly a year, spending 48 weeks in the top 75. The Beatles went through this as well. If you're banned, if you create all this controversy, does that make people not want to listen to your album? No. It makes them seek it out all the more because what is this? It's so bad I can't listen to it. So they did him a favor. John Lydon, or Johnny Rotten, Steve Jones, and Paul Cook wrote the album's 12 tracks between August of 75 and June of 76, with Glenn Matlock, as I said, acting as a co-writer on most of the tracks. On October 8th, 1976, EMI, they're going to appear as a song title with the last track of this album, signed the group into a 2-year contract. They recorded Anarchy in the UK and began sessions for the newly written God Save the Queen that month. In November of 76, so the next month, the first singles were released to great commercial success, Anarchy in the UK. But due to the nature of the material and the band's image, they caused heavy controversy and were dropped from the label in January of 1977. So just 3.5 months later, they go from having a record deal to being dropped. The next month, in February of 77, Glenn Matlock quits, reportedly over the lyrics of God Save the Queen, but I couldn't really corroborate that anywhere. Close to completing a deal now with A&M Records in March of 77. So look, all this stuff's happening quickly. They entered Wessex Sound Studios to record producer Chris Thomas and engineer Bill Price. New bassist Sid Vicious played on the tracks. These are the ones he played on. He played on Bodies and he played on God Save the Queen. But his performance skills were not considered fit to record the full album. So first, remember, Steve Jones ends up doing it. But first, the band manager Malcolm McLaren was asked to convince the previous bassist Glenn Matlock. So Glenn left the band. And the next month, Malcolm goes back to him and says, will you come play on these? He said, yeah, but you're going to have to pay me ahead of time. They didn't pay him up front, so they had to not do that. 4 days after recording was completed, they signed with A&M. Yet on March 16th, the label terminated the contract, and several thousand copies of the forthcoming God Save the Queen single were destroyed. Despite being dropped, the manager, Michael McLaren, instructed him to continue working on the album. So they've already been dropped by 2 labels within like 3 months. While McLaren pondered whether or not to sign the offer presented by Virgin Records, he signed a French deal for the group with Barclay Records in early May 1977. At the same time, the group resumed work with Thomas and Price. I have a reason why I'm telling you all this, because there's all these versions of this album out there, right? And this kind of sets a stage of why. Meanwhile, the Pistols have been rejected by labels CBS, Decca, Pi, and Polydor, leaving only Virgin's offer. McLaren still hoped to sign with a major label, and it wanted to issue a one-off single with Virgin to increase the band's appeal to the larger record company. Of course, Virgin owner Richard Branson refused. Why would he do that to help them get a different? So on May 18th, they finally signed with Virgin. 2 weeks later, the label Rush released God Save the Queen as a single. And then Boys and Girls, it all really starts. They deliver the album, and Richard Branson spends an entire night, overnight, trying to decide on the track list, because the band didn't want them to use the singles, because if you remember, the Beatles didn't use their singles on their albums. It was very frowned upon, saying that you were trying to steal from the people, right? They had the 45 and they were trying to sell it to them on the album. But Branson did his own thing. And due to the album's long completion time, the Sex Pistols and McLaren had decided to release Holidays in the Sun backed with Satellite as the band's 4th single. So now you got another song out there. It was not successful as past singles, but it still went to number 8. And a lot of people believe it's because they'd already announced it was going to be included on the album, so people didn't go buy the single. It's probably right. In an attempt to stem criticism over the decision to include all 4 previously released singles, Virgin indicated the possibility of an alternative album being issued simultaneously, featuring a new title and 2 new songs replacing 2 of the former hit singles. A label spokesman stated, "We put the singles on the LP because most people wanted it that way, but the alternative set would enable us to overcome the multiple stores banned. A 10-song test pressing was made, though no new cuts were included, with Satellite and Submission being added as bonus tracks." So a lot of record companies said, we won't sell your album if we've already sold the singles. The album was originally going to be titled God Save Sex Pistols. Jamie Reed's cover concept refrained from including a picture of the group and instead was day-glow red and yellow in color, with cutout lettering and a finish resembling crude screen prints, while the US version was pink with the Sex Pistols logo. The album's title changed in mid-1977 based on a phrase supplied by Steve Jones. Jones said he picked up the phrase "never mind the Bollocks" from 2 fans who would always say it to one another. Johnny Rotten explained its meaning as a working class expression to stop talking rubbish. In 2015, this album was put into the Grammy Hall of Fame. Now, I'm just going to say this because we are reactions to the classics. Obviously, 3,000 videos. We have a lot of different videos up that some of you may not consider classics, but being a connoisseur of music history, this is not the first punk album ever. It's not even close, right? A lot of people talk about the Ramones, but the Ramones never got politically charged. So this is where Sex Pistols are a little different. You can talk about MC5, you can talk about Iggy and the Stooges, but this is not the first punk, but it is way different. And all the research I did talking about in the UK, how much more this hit because it was political and all these different things. So they did it a different way. Even the Sex Pistols look and kind of persona were taken from a guy named Richard Hell, a New York rocker. So I just want to get it out of the way before we get all that in the comments. I'm not saying they're the first punk, and a lot of people don't even consider this total punk, but you know, there's an attitude. They were much more about the persona than the music, and I think over time, everything I've read, that kind of made the music go on the back burner, and the music is quite influential. So let's put the music back on the forefront. All tracks written by Paul Cook, Steve Jones, Glenn Matlock, and Johnny Rotten, except where noted. So we'll kick this off with the first track, Holidays in the Sun. Now, I told you there's all these different versions of this album floating around out there. There's 4 different versions of this album that I could just find research on. I'm going to use the version that's on Spotify because that's what I use. It's the 12-track US version. I would rather use the original UK version. And yes, I could become a little creative and just shift the order around because that's all it is on a few songs. But we're just going to go with the US edition. So I'm just getting it out of the way in case you own the original UK edition and going, what is going on here? It's the way Spotify has it. It's what they have available where I live. So Holidays in the Sun, 4th single. Remember I mentioned it. They released it before the album came out. Went to number 8 in the UK. Rolling Stone ranked it 43 in the 100 greatest guitar songs of all time. It supposedly was inspired by a trip to the Channel Island of Jersey. We tried, John Lydon or Johnny Rotten said, we tried our holiday in the sun in the Isle of Jersey, and that didn't work. They threw us out. That trip was followed by a couple of weeks spent in Berlin. Although they described the city as raining and depressing, they were relieved to get away from London. John said, being in London at the time made us feel like we were trapped in a prison camp environment. There was hatred and constant threat of violence. The best thing we could do was to go set up in a prison camp somewhere else. Berlin and its decadence was a good idea. The song came about from that. I loved Berlin. I loved the wall and the insanity of the place. The communists looked in on the circus atmosphere of West Berlin, which never went to sleep, and that would be their impression of the West. So there was a lot of violence because of God Save the Queen, a lot of threats towards the Pistols. I'll get into that when we get to this song. If you haven't been with us before, the music will not be in the video, but it's going to be at that Vimeo link below. Once again, thank you to the patrons for choosing this album. All right, Steve Jones's guitar definitely stands on that. There's only one guitar player, and that's Steve, but definitely stands out there. The song itself, all about the Berlin Wall, which if your memory doesn't go pre-1989, it's not going to mean a lot to you. For people like me, like it's a huge deal, man, a huge deal. So a good song, definitely enjoyed it, definitely energetic. Next up, we have Bodies. Tackles the subject of abortion with lyrics described as, quote, some of the most uncompromising, gut-wrenching lyrics imaginable. Now, the song's mostly about a real fan of theirs, Pauline, who was, as the song states, from Birmingham. She'd been in a mental institution, I can't make this stuff up, where she supposedly lived in a treehouse in a garden in that mental institution. This was where the line, her name was Pauline, she lived in a tree, comes from. The institution was also where she seems to have been raped by one of the male nurses. When she was released, she traveled to London, where she became a punk rock fan. She had several abortions. This is like hardcore stuff, guys. This is what he said. According to John Lydon, she showed up once at his door wearing nothing but a clear plastic bag and holding an aborted fetus. According to his biography, she told him about becoming pregnant and then having abortions, and she described them in detail to him. This affected him enough to write the song. Most of the band also had experiences with Pauline, but have spoken less about it. So this is definitely not embracing abortion. He said it's doing neither one, but he said it wants you to think hard about it. All right, Bodies. Some really hard-hitting lyrics. I'm not going to read them to you. You can go check it out if you want to know exactly what it says, if you don't already. But yeah, obviously an incredibly interesting song for him to decide to write, right? And I'll tell you some 2 songs through, and I read about this. They spent a ton of time producing this album, a ton of time after it was recorded and mixing it. Like, this is very well done. It's not some sort of rebellious thing that they threw out there. Like, it's really well done. The production is very nice on this song in particular. Next up, we got No Feelings. In this song, John creates a self-absorbed character with narcissistic tendencies that has no feelings. Johnny stated, the song is from the idea of someone being completely selfish, which I'm not. I like to imagine being in that frame of mind. I'm insulting myself, really. That happens a lot. He also said, I wrote this song because my dad was sponsoring a lot of orphans at the time, and one of the girls just became too attached to me. I had to tell her, look, I have no feelings. Just because my dad is letting you stay at his house for the weekend doesn't mean you can marry me. But there's this sad truth of orphans, which I've always donated money to, and that's that they grow up with a prison-like mentality. They're not attached to anybody or anything, so they're very desperate and very clingy to anything they can translate very quickly into love. And it's false love. It's really desperation. I'm so wounded for them in that respect. In the song, it may seem like I have no empathy, but it's the exact opposite. It's irony. He also says, some of the songs I've written have so many words, it's almost unbearable. This song, for instance, I think it's 16 to 18 lines where I don't take a breath. Now, live, that's tempting fate, but I managed to do it. I found the knack. I love pushing those boundaries. You can't cut up a verse like that because it would become out of context. It's the monologue that's necessary to paint the proper picture of someone in a state of babbling confusion. All right, No Feelings. Another song that's very catchy, very well produced. I thought John, aka Johnny, did a really good job on that. The guitar work and the drumming were fantastic. I forgot to mention in Bodies, that was one of the 2 songs that the previous track that Sid did the bass work on. So just when we're talking about instrumentation stuff, but I thought the song was really good. I mean, I thought it was really well done. I don't really got to explain it to you because I already explained it to you with what John said about it. Next up, we got Wire. This song's probably about Malcolm McLaren, their manager, the person responsible for putting the band together. In the song, he's accused of greediness, being incompetent, as the title states, of being a liar. However, according to John, the song isn't exclusively about McLaren, but also about those outside the band who try to manipulate them. He told Rolling Stone, many people inspired Wire, starting with the manager, Malcolm McLaren. We were just hapless young idiots, really, and we were just really unprepared for the world of greed and adulthood that we were thrown into so quickly, as anybody would be. Everyone had their piece of poisonous influence to whisper in your ear, and that could cause great division. So I just came around to the point where instead of allowing division, I would unleash my derision. But the song isn't totally about Malcolm. I think we always knew that about him. In an odd way, it was one of the most adorable features. I guess they knew he was going to try to screw him over. But do you know when you really know someone, you kind of accept those kinds of things because you take everything with a pinch of salt? It's the people outside of the band I'm really aiming at. Those who are trying to maneuver into us. And it's still the same way today, but it was way worse back then, right? In the 50s, 60s, and 70s. These record companies, these managers, just predatory. A lot of these bands that, quote, hit it big, never ended up with any money at all because it was all right, just calling it out. Johnny's calling it out. I'm going to be a broken record on every song, but I don't know. I guess in my mind, this was going to be like a little more of a raw, like we're coming at you out. This song is very catchy, excellent drumming, excellent guitar work, so well produced. I know I keep repeating the same things, but it's what it is, man. And I'm like I said, I didn't go in there with that preconception. Next up, we have Problems, which was a song they just cooked up in the studio one night when they acknowledged they had run out of song ideas. All right, a little over 4 minutes long. Probably a little bit too long if it's a song you just came up with. My least favorite song, not a bad song. I mean, when you got Paul on drums and Steve on guitar, they can carry just about anything. But next up, we got God Save the Queen, which was flipped with Problems in the UK. I probably should have just flipped them. But, you know, if you're in the US and you go to the album, this is the way you've heard it. So I try to stay true to that. Second single was released during Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee in 1977. It's taken directly, of course, the title from the British national anthem. At the time, the song was highly controversial for its equation of Queen Elizabeth with a fascist regime, and for the lyric, "There is no future in England's dreaming." According to Glenn Matlock, who had co-written the song, although he was no longer a member of the band by the time it was released, the bass was inspired by the Moves' Fire Brigade. Guitarist Steve Jones stated that when Matlock first played him the song, it did not sound like God Save This Queen. It was like Love Me Do or something. Although many believe it was created because of the Silver Jubilee, the band has denied it, with Paul Cook saying that, quote, "It wasn't written specifically for the Queen's Jubilee. We weren't aware of it at the time. It wasn't a contrived effort to go out and shock everyone." Johnny Rotten has explained the lyrics as follows. "You don't write God Save the Queen because you hate the English race. You write a song like that because you love them and you're fed up with them being mistreated." He intended to evoke sympathy for the English working class and a general resentment towards the monarchy. On June 7th, 1977, the Jubilee holiday, the band attempted to play the song from a boat named the Queen Elizabeth on the River Thames near the Palace of Westminster. After a scuffle involving attendee Jay Wobble and the cameraman, 11 people, including Malcolm McLaren, the man who organized the concert, and several members of the band's entourage were arrested when the boat was docked. The single was released on May 27th, 1977, and was regarded by many as the general public as an assault on Queen Elizabeth and the monarchy. During the media furor over the single, White and producers Bill Price and Chris Thomas were subject to a razor attack outside a pub in London. Before the group signed to Virgin, a small number of copies, I mentioned this at the start, but I didn't go into the details, of God Save the Queen have been pressed on the A&M label. These are now among the most valuable records ever produced, with a resale value of up to £13,000 a copy, depending on condition, although that was shattered. Record Collector named the A&M single the most collectible record of all time. Now stop and think about that. That's insane, like of all the records ever made. On July 5th, 2024, so really just about a month and a half before I recorded this, a new record sale price of £24,320, or in my US dollars, $31,000 was set at an auction house. So that, you gotta want that record back. Some other things that go into this. I've got more on this just because it's so important. The major retailers, Boots, W.H. Smith, and Woolworths, all declined to sell the record. Nevertheless, it peaked at number 2 on the official UK singles chart used by the BBC. It was below Rod Stewart's I Don't Want to Talk About It, released as a double A-side budget single, along with the first cut as The Deepest. It did so during the week of the Silver Jubilee's official observation went to 2. On the singles chart displayed in branches of W.H. Smith, one of the places that wouldn't sell it, the singles position number 2 is represented by a blank line. However, various sources state that it was the highest selling by far of the week. It's a little conspiracy action, right? According to a 1998 article in The Independent, for 1 week, compilers decreed that shops which sold their own records could not have those records represented in the chart. Well, remember they signed with Virgin, so thus all the records sold in the Virgin megastores couldn't be counted towards it. So that's how they manipulated it. The NME magazine did have it chart at number 1, however. Rolling Stone ranked this as number 175 on the 500 greatest songs of all time. It's also one of Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. The single's picture sleeve featured a defaced image of Queen Elizabeth II, was designed by Jamie Reed, and in 2001 was ranked number 1 in a list of the 100 greatest record covers of all time by Q Magazine. All right, God Save the Queen. So I'm going to be the first one to tell you, right? I mean, I was 5 or 6 years old when this song came out. I mean, this album went to like 106 in the U.S. This album and the Sex Pistols never gained any traction in the U.S. Retrospectively, they have, and everybody holds them up. But so I would have never come across the song. I never have. And so it's hard for me. I don't understand the monarchy. I'm not from the UK. So it's not going to mean the same thing to me. I recognized all that going into this review, the album and all of it. This is a really good song. Like, it's very catchy. Once again, guitar and drumming are top notch and some very fire lyrics. So, I mean, I can see why it might have got some people upset. God Save the Queen, verse 2. I could choose any verse because tourists her money and her figurehead is not what she seems. Oh, God save history. God save your mad parade. Oh, Lord, God have mercy. All crimes are paid. Just, I mean, the song is really well done, whether you're live in the UK and understand the monarchy or not. Now we'll start off the traditional second side with 17. A song with anti-hippie sentiment. Johnny Rotten, in his book Anger is an Energy, said, quote, "It's very much an anti-hippie thing, drawing up the battle lines with him. Let's all live in the forest together. F off. Listen, I'm all for passive resistance. I understand it's a vital way of bringing down empires. But the hippie thing of peace and love, nah. It didn't actually mean anything, and it was never conjured into anything solid. When I went to festivals, I'd watch them squabbling over where to park their Volkswagens and pitching their designer tents and arguing about peg holes. Come on, where's your peace and love now? I'm a lazy sod. I'm lazy Sid." A little shout out to Sid in there. Johnny actually talked about that line. He told Rolling Stone, as far as the lazy sod part, the band really was a full-on 24/7 kind of situation. Then, of course, came the trying to tour and the banning. Every time a gig is canceled, it's a major rejection because you go through all the fears and phobias, not wanting to let people down. And then some other people let you down by canceling it. That's a stress. So, 2-minute song, nice little this 2-minute punk song, catchy in the I'm a Lazy Sod, little harmonies in that. We already had God Save the Queen. Now we got the other massive song in here, Anarchy in the UK. Releases their debut single in November of 1976, so way before this album. It's number 56 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. And just like God Save the Queen, it's also included in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. And originally issued in a plain black sleeve, the single was the only Sex Pistols recording released by EMI. We'll get to EMI in a little bit, by the way. Reached number 38 on the UK singles chart before EMI dropped the group a month after members of the band used profanity during a live television broadcast. Producer Chris Thomas layered multiple tracks. This is what I'm talking about, man. The production on this album is not, we're a bunch of outlaws going in here, we're going to put this thing out real raw. Like, he layered multiple tracks of Steve Jones's guitar to create, quote, a searing wall of sound, while Johnny Rotten spewed the vocals, quote, as if his teeth had been ground down to points. In the documentary The Filth and the Fury, John Lydon described the composition of the song's opening lyrics, explaining that the best rhyme he could devise for the first line, I am an antichrist, was the second line, I'm an anarchist. He confirmed that he is not indeed an anarchist in a 2012 interview. Manager Malcolm McLaren considered the song, quote, a call to arms to the kids who believe that rock and roll was taken away from them. It's a statement of self-rule, of ultimate independence. The abbreviation used in the lyrics are a selection of Civil War references from the 1970s headlines, a suggestion of what could happen in the UK. The IRA and the UDA were the largest paramilitary armies in the conflict in Northern Ireland. All right, Anarchy in the UK. Obviously, Steve Jones's guitar work on here is at a next level. You did also have Glenn Matlock on the bass on this one. You can kind of tell a difference in there. And, you know, it's low-hanging fruit. To bring a song like this, it's definitely going to get the youth fired up. You know, it's easy to do, calling for Anarchy in the UK, but thought it was catchy, thought it was extremely well produced, and I can see why it did so well. And I guess I can see why in a conservative world in 1976 it upset EMI so much, I guess. I mean, he's not calling people to arms or anything, but, you know, this is a little different time. Next up, we have the longest song on here. It's 1 second longer than Wire. We got Submission. This is a funny story. So Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren owned a store called, it's all in caps, SEX, so sex, but he's probably calling it SEX, that sold various fetish items. He asked the band to write a song about bondage. And so John, or Johnny Rotten, having already grown tired of McLaren, remember the song Wire, wrote the lyrics of not about a sexual submissive, but about an underwater vessel, the first line of which is, "I'm on a submarine mission for you, baby." So giving Malcolm the middle finger, so to speak. All right, Submission, a little different musical-wise and arrangement-wise, right? The instrumentation was much more crisp and finite, so I almost would have thought this was some sort of remastered track or something, but they definitely went for a little less punk here. I mean, you still get the sound a little bit, but kind of shows their versatility and how they could sound pretty much more mainstream if they wanted to. I've got 3 tracks left. We got Pretty Vacant. This was the 3rd single. First song ever written by the band, went to 6 in the UK. According to former bassist at the time, then he came back later on, but that's another story, Glenn Matlock. The song's main riff was inspired by hearing SOS by ABBA. In an interview for the June 2022 issue of Uncut, Matlock said that Pretty Vacant, which is my song and my lyrics, I took inspiration from Richard Hell's Blank Generation, but I kind of misunderstood what his song was all about. You got to put the songs in the context of what was going on for a bloke like me in mid-70s London, with the 3-day week and the IRA bombings and power cuts, against the fact that I was a young man who met some interesting people who was trying to form a rock and roll band. Pretty Vacant is a primal scream kind of thing. We don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to do it anyway. NME named this the single of the year in 1977. All right, Pretty Vacant. I got to be careful. They caused a lot of controversy because of the way that Johnny sang the word vacant. You can go back and listen to it. So they knew how to stoke the fire, right? They were doing these things intentionally. One other thing that Glenn Matlock said, he said, because of the PA system that we had, John couldn't hear himself, which probably contributed to his vocal style. And we couldn't hear him because we were too busy making too much noise. So I didn't realize until the record had come out that he changed 2 lines in the second verse. But the rest of the song is mine. But I thought it is the Sex Pistols that has that sound. So good. 2 songs left. We have New York. It's a rant about bands from New York in general, but especially the New York Dolls, who these guys didn't like and who Malcolm McLaren briefly managed prior to the Sex Pistols. All right, New York. So Johnny's just going after the New York Dolls. He goes after Max's Kansas, which he says thinks it's swelling, playing Max's Kansas City, where, I mean, all kinds of people played, not just the New York Dolls, Bowie, the Ramones, but these guys despise those guys. And then making fun of the New York Dolls, says a few words in here that you can't say anymore, but just really going after. Look, he's looking for shock value and he gets it, right? And making fun of their drug addiction and that sort of stuff. So the song, I'm sure, was very effective at what they were trying to do. All right, now we got the last track, EMI, little shot to their former record label. It's written after their contract had been terminated after only 3 months following the publicity storm caused by the appearance on the Today program in December of '76. The song, often called the diss track, mocks the label for wanting to cash in on the growing punk phenomenon and signing the band, only to drop them when the group's antics damaged the label's reputation. Which you get, right? You want punk, you want these rebels, but then when they act like what they are, you drop them. The Sex Pistols lead singer Johnny Rotten described EMI as one of my faves, and in 2017 he told Rolling Stone, EMI wanted to sign us to show what a grand, varied label they were. They were really not. The song was fun to write. It was actually mostly done in the studio because the groove was there and it was relentless. All right, EMI. Obviously a biting criticism. I mean, the chorus of it is EMI. Going after EMI, another fantastic guitar performance by Steve Jones. Just a fantastic performance. And they knew they were going to get a response from this as well, and it built on the image. And I'll kind of get into that. Let's get into my favorite tracks, and I'll give my overall thoughts on the album. I don't want to get ahead of myself. My favorite tracks, I almost feel like they're a cop-out because they're really all the singles and one other song. But honorable mention, the fourth single that they dropped right before this album came out, Holidays in the Sun. Faves are going to be No Feelings, so that snuck in there. God Save the Queen, Anarchy in the UK, and Pretty Vacant. Now we'll go to my overall score. So I think the big controversy that I read about these guys is basically, I mean, I like punk music. I like punk music a lot. I think this is almost like punk rock, right? Because it has some great melodies in there. The guitar work, obviously, the star of this for me is Steve Jones, and Paul Cook on the drums is shortly behind that. But Johnny Rotten is very good at what he does on the vocals. He varies up the style of delivery. Like, it's perfect for this stuff. So do they really believe this? Or are they good at manufacturing what's going to piss people off, right? Anarchy in the UK, God Save the Queen, EMI, like, did they know what would get people wound up? Was it almost like dog whistling them, so to speak? I don't know, because I didn't live through it, and I'm not from the UK, so it's not really for me to decide that. But you take a band almost like The Clash, who I really believe they believed what they were talking about. I'm not sure these guys do, but maybe they did. And that's where the thing comes in of like, are these guys totally legit or not? But they built a reputation on being that countercultural, rebellious. And like I said, I think they're known for that now and not known for the quality of this album. Is that because this album isn't great? It's not, because this album is great. I really enjoyed this album. I'm not going to be at a perfect 10 out of 10 like a lot of retrospective reviews are, because I've listened to it once. And also, like I said, it's not going to ever have the same meaning for me because of all the things I laid out. But for me, it's going to be a very, very high 8.5. Every song is good. And some of them are borderline great. None of them are great for me either. But that's because I've heard them once. But 8.5. So let me know what you think of this album down below. Where do you rate it? Do you think it's the greatest punk album of all time? Those are all fantastic questions that I wish we could have a two-way conversation about. All right, thanks again for the patrons for requesting this thing. And as I mentioned before, if you're watching this on YouTube and you want to become part of the Patreon community for as little as $1 a month, check out that Patreon link below. We got a free trial going on. Until next time, guys, I will see you.